The story of humanity does not begin with cities, kings, or even gold. It begins in the dust. 6 million years ago, in the sprawling grasslands of East Africa, the climate began to change. The dense protective canopies of the rainforests started to thin, replaced by vast, shimmering savannas. For our distant ancestors, the choice was simple: adapt or vanish. This environmental shift forced a peculiar group of primates to do something revolutionary. They climbed down from the trees and stood up. By standing on two legs, we gained a perspective no other creature had. We could see predators over the tall grass, and more importantly, our hands were finally free. Free to carry food, free to protect our young, and eventually, free to create. But for millions of years, we were just another animal in the middle of the food chain. We weren't the strongest, the fastest, or the most fearsome. We lived in the shadow of giant cats and lived off the scraps of larger predators. However, around 2.5 million years ago, a creature emerged that we now call Homo habilis, the handyman. They began to pick up stones, not just to throw, but to shape. By striking one rock against another, they created the first technology, the sharpened edge. With a simple stone flake, we became hunters. We broke into the nutrient-rich bone marrow that other scavengers couldn't reach. This high-protein diet fueled the most expensive organ in the body, the brain. As our brains grew, so did our curiosity. Around 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus appeared. They were the first to truly look at the horizon and walk toward it, spreading out of Africa and into the far reaches of Asia and Europe. But their greatest achievement wasn't travel, it was the mastery of fire. Fire changed everything. It provided warmth in the cold, protection from the dark, and it allowed us to cook. Cooking pre-digested our food, giving us a massive surplus of energy that further accelerated our brain's evolution. Around the campfire, the first social bonds were forged. Then, roughly 300,000 years ago, a new player entered the stage, Homo sapiens. Physically, we weren't much different from our cousins, the Neanderthals, but we possessed a secret weapon that would change the planet forever: the cognitive revolution. Unlike any other species, humans developed the ability to speak about things that weren't physically there. We could share myths, imagine futures, and cooperate in groups larger than any family unit. We didn't just communicate facts, we told stories. This shared imagination allowed thousands of strangers to work together towards a single goal. 70,000 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption or a sudden shift in climate pushed our species to the brink of extinction. Our population dwindled to just a few thousand individuals. We were an endangered species. Yet it was during this bottleneck that our ancestors made their move. We pushed out of Africa in a final great migration. Equipped with bone needles for tailored clothing, seafaring rafts, and complex social structures, Homo sapiens conquered every environment on Earth. From the frozen tundras of Siberia to the tropical islands of the Pacific, we didn't just survive, we dominated. We replaced all other human species, becoming the last ones standing. As the first chapter of our history closes, the stage is set. The wandering hunters have conquered the globe. But soon, the greatest change in human history would occur, not in our bodies, but in the way we lived with the land. The age of the nomad was ending. The age of the settler was about to begin. For nearly 200,000 years, the rhythm of human life was defined by the search. We followed the herds. We moved with the seasons. We took only what the wild offered. But around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age retreated and the world began to warm, the greatest gamble in human history took place. We stopped running. In a region known as the Fertile Crescent, stretching from the Nile Valley to the Persian Gulf, nature provided a unique laboratory. Here, wild wheats and barleys grew in abundance. At first, humans simply harvested these wild grains. But slowly, almost accidentally, we noticed that seeds dropped in the moist soil near our camps grew into new plants. We began to intervene. We cleared the weeds. We diverted small streams. We saved the best seeds for the next season. This was the birth of agriculture. It wasn't an overnight triumph. It was a slow, grueling trap. Historians often call this the agricultural revolution, but for the individual human, it was a radical shift in the quality of life. As a hunter-gatherer, your diet was diverse, and your body was built for movement. As a farmer, your world shrunk to a few acres of dirt. You spent your days bent over, tilling the soil under a punishing sun. Our spines and joints, evolved for climbing and running, began to show the wear and tear of repetitive labor. The first signs of arthritis and slipped discs appear in the skeletons of these early pioneers. But while the individual suffered, the species exploded. Agriculture allowed us to produce a surplus. For the first time, one person could grow enough food to feed 10. This surplus changed the very fabric of human psychology. If you have more food than you can eat today, you need a place to store it. You need to protect it. You need to stay put. The temporary tents of the nomad were replaced by the mud brick houses of the settler. Villages like Jericho and Çatalhöyük emerged, housing hundreds, then thousands of people. But when you live in close quarters with thousands of people and their domesticated animals, the world changes again. The proximity to cows, pigs, and fowl brought a new shadow: infectious diseases. Smallpox, flu, and malaria began to jump from animal to human, thinning the ranks of the early pioneers. However, the surplus food did something even more profound. It gave us time. In a hunter-gatherer tribe, everyone is a food finder. In a settled village, if there is enough grain in the storehouse, not everyone has to farm. This led to specialization. One person became a potter, another a weaver, another a blacksmith. We began to refine our tools, moving from stone to copper and eventually to bronze. With specialization came hierarchy. If there is a surplus, someone must decide how it is distributed. Groups of elders became councils. Councils became leaders. Leaders became kings. We began to see the first divisions of class, the haves and the have-nots. To keep track of who owned which bag of grain or which plot of land, we needed more than just memory. In the city-states of Sumer, we pressed reeds into wet clay to create the first marks of accounting. This was the birth of writing. By the end of this era, the landscape of the planet had been permanently altered. Forests were burned to make way for fields. Rivers were dammed to water the crops. We had moved from being a part of the ecosystem to being the masters of it. The agricultural revolution was the foundation of everything we call modernity. It gave us the city, the state, the written word, and the organized religion, but it also brought us war, inequality, and plague. We had traded the freedom of the wilderness for the security of the walls, and inside those walls, the first great civilizations were about to rise. As the small farming villages of the previous era swelled into massive cities, humanity entered a new, grander stage. This was the era of the empire. No longer were we governed by the local customs of a single tribe. Now, millions of people, speaking different languages and living thousands of miles apart, were united under a single law, a single ruler, and a single vision. By 3000 BCE, along the banks of the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates, the first great superstates emerged. In Egypt, the pharaohs built monuments that touched the sky, the pyramids, symbolizing a power that was both political and divine. In Mesopotamia, the city of Babylon became a shimmering metropolis of science and law. These empires were the first engines of globalization. They built roads that stretched across continents, created standardized currencies, and established the first postal systems. But as empires grew larger, they became harder to hold together by force alone. A king can command a man's body with a sword, but to rule 1 million people, you must command their hearts and minds. This necessity birthed the axial age, a pivotal period around 500 BCE when almost simultaneously across the globe, humanity began to ask the big questions. In the foothills of the Himalayas, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama abandoned his palace to seek the end of suffering, becoming the Buddha. In the warring states of China, Confucius designed a system of ethics and social harmony that would last for millennia. In the Middle East, the prophets of monotheism began to preach of a single universal God who demanded not just sacrifice, but morality. These faiths provided a social glue. They taught people how to behave toward strangers and gave them a sense of purpose beyond survival. Religion and empire became two sides of the same coin. The Silk Road, the greatest trade network in history, didn't just carry silk, spices, and gold. It carried ideas. A merchant from India could travel to the Mediterranean and find people who shared his philosophy. A scholar from Rome could find common ground with a mathematician from Persia. The peak of this era saw the rise of the Roman Empire in the West and the Han Dynasty in the East. These two giants represented the height of ancient sophistication. Rome gave the world the foundations of law and engineering, aqueducts that carried water for miles, and roads so durable they are still visible today. Meanwhile, the Han Dynasty perfected the civil service, ensuring that the brightest minds, not just the richest, governed the land. Yet this was also an era of immense shadows. The grandeur of the Colosseum and the Great Wall was built on the backs of millions of slaves and forced laborers. Empires expanded through brutal conquest, and the same roads that carried philosophers also carried devastating plagues and invading armies. By the middle of the first millennium, the great classical empires began to buckle under their own weight. Rome fell to Germanic tribes, the Han Dynasty splintered into warring factions. But the empires didn't truly die, they transformed. The political structures collapsed, but the faiths remained. Christianity spread across the ruins of Europe. Islam united the fractured tribes of the Arabian Peninsula and created a golden age of science and faith. And Buddhism traveled deep into the hearts of East Asia. The world was no longer a collection of isolated islands of people. It was a web of interconnected civilizations held together by the power of the written word and the strength of shared belief. Humanity was now organized, disciplined, and driven by a sense of divine mission. The stage was set for the next great leap, a leap that would take us from the wisdom of the ancients to the cold, hard logic of the machine. For thousands of years, the speed of human life was limited by the strength of a horse and the breath of the wind. We lived in a world of tradition, where the answers to the universe were found in ancient books. But in the 16th century, a crack appeared in that foundation. Humanity stopped looking backward for answers and started looking through a lens. The scientific revolution began not with a loud explosion, but with a quiet realization. We didn't know as much as we thought. When Copernicus looked at the stars and realized the Earth moved around the sun, and when Galileo turned his telescope to the moons of Jupiter, the old maps of reality were torn apart. We moved from a universe of mystery to a universe of mathematics. We discovered gravity, the circulation of blood, and the laws of motion. Knowledge was no longer a gift from the past, it was a frontier to be conquered. This new mindset of discovery fueled the age of exploration. Armed with better compasses and sturdier ships, European explorers crossed the Atlantic and Pacific. They weren't just looking for knowledge, they were looking for gold, land, and spices. This era connected the world for the first time in history, but it came at a staggering cost. The Columbian Exchange brought tomatoes and potatoes to Europe, but it brought smallpox and conquest to the Americas. The rise of global trade was built on the dark foundations of the Atlantic slave trade and the colonization of distant lands. The world was shrinking, but it was also bleeding. Then, in the late 1700s, in the damp coal mines of Britain, the second great explosion happened. For all of human history, work was done by muscle, human or animal. but we discovered how to bottle the power of a volcano. The steam engine was the great liberator of energy. By burning coal to boil water, we created a force that never got tired, never needed to sleep, and could do the work of 1,000 horses. The Industrial Revolution transformed the face of the planet almost overnight. The quiet, green countryside was replaced by the dark, satanic mills of growing cities like Manchester and New York. People who had been farmers for 100 generations moved into cramped tenements to work in factories. The rhythm of life was no longer set by the rising sun, but by the factory whistle and the ticking clock. This era gave us the steamship, the locomotive, and eventually the telegraph. Information, which used to travel at the speed of a galloping horse, now moved at the speed of light. We were no longer local citizens. We were becoming a global civilization. We mastered steel, we harnessed electricity, and we began to mass-produce everything from clothing to weapons. But this new power was a double-edged sword. As we became more productive, we became more dangerous. The same factories that made shoes could make rifles. The same chemistry that made fertilizer could make explosives. The gap between the industrialized nations and the rest of the world grew into a canyon, leading to a new age of fierce imperial competition. By the dawn of the 20th century, humanity was like a child who had found a loaded gun. We had more power than we had the wisdom to control. We had conquered the sea and the land, and we were beginning to eye the sky. We were healthier, wealthier, and more connected than ever before. But the gears of industry were grinding toward a collision that would test whether our species could survive its own brilliance. The age of the machine had arrived, and there was no going back. As the 20th century dawned, humanity possessed the power of gods, but we were still governed by the ancient instincts of the tribe. The machines we built for progress were quickly turned toward destruction. The first half of the century was defined by a total war that the world had never seen, an industrialization of death. 2 world wars reshaped the map of the planet, leading to the collapse of old empires and the rise of 2 new superpowers. But from the ashes of the greatest conflict in history, a new world emerged. In 1945, at the birth of the atomic age, we realized that for the first time we had the power to end our own story. This great fear forced a strange kind of peace and a frantic race for superiority. We didn't just compete on battlefields, we competed in laboratories and in the stars. In 1969, just 66 years after the first airplane took flight, a human being stepped onto the surface of the moon. We had finally left the cradle of Earth. While we were looking at the stars, a quieter revolution was happening in our pockets and on our desks. We discovered how to etch logic onto tiny slivers of silicon. The information revolution was not about moving bodies or goods, it was about moving thoughts. The invention of the computer and the birth of the internet in the late 20th century did for the mind what the steam engine had done for the muscle. Suddenly, the sum total of all human knowledge was available to anyone, anywhere, at the touch of a screen. The walls that had separated cultures for millennia began to dissolve. We became a global village, interconnected by fiber optic cables and satellite signals. But as we entered the 21st century, we realized that our rapid progress had come with a heavy bill. The same industrial fires that gave us modern medicine and global travel had altered the very chemistry of our atmosphere. Climate change became the defining challenge of our era, a test of whether a global civilization could cooperate to save its own home. Today, we stand at the edge of the digital frontier. We are no longer just using tools, we are creating intelligence. Artificial intelligence is beginning to outperform us in logic, data, and even creativity. We are experimenting with the code of life itself, editing DNA as if it were software. The line between the biological and the technological is starting to blur. If you look back at the 50,000-year journey we have just traveled, the speed of change is breathtaking. For most of our history, life for a grandchild was exactly the same as it was for a grandfather. Today, the world changes every 5 years. We are the first generation of humans who do not know what the world will look like for our children. We started as a vulnerable primate on the African savanna, armed with nothing but a sharpened stone and a story. We have survived ice ages, plagues, and our own capacity for violence. We have built cathedrals, split the atom, and sent our voices into the vacuum of space. As this final chapter closes, the complete history of humanity is far from over. In fact, it feels like we're just finishing the prologue. We are the architects of the next era. Whether we use our digital tools to create a sustainable paradise or a fractured dystopia is a story that is currently being written, not by fate, but by us. The dawn of man has passed, the noon of empires is gone, and we now stand in the bright, uncertain light of the future.